Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Saibono Discovery Center. Learners, today we are dealing with internal resistance. Please take note, we are dealing with paper 2. And when we deal with paper 2, it is pertinent that we understand that paper 2, as paper 1, has been divided into 3 source-based questions, 3 essay questions. Now, internal resistance, it is basically question 1 for paper 2. Then question 2 would be what we call the TRC, and question 3 would be globalization. The question 4 essay would be basically what we would classify as Steve Biko BCM essay. Question 5 is Road to Democracy, and then the last essay, it is basically Gorbachev's reforms and how it impacted South African politics. But today we are going to focus on internal resistance, which is question 1 of the source base. So before we go into the content, we are going to go through the process where we need to understand how to analyze and how to interpret different source-based questions. Now let's quickly go into the cognitive level. The cognitive levels are basically 3 levels that we are confronted with for question 1, question 2, and question 3 at the same time. Now, it's pertinent that we understand when we talk about cognitive levels, we're talking about our thinking ability, how we interpret certain things. Now, let's quickly go to the historical skills of the cognitive levels. Let's go to level 1. As you can see on the screen, level 1, it's extract evidence from sources. It's a selection and organization of relevant information from different sources, define historical concept or terminologies, and the weighting there is 30%, and the mark allocation will be 14 marks. Let's go to level 2. Level 2 will be interpretation of evidence from sources. You must explain information gathered from sources, analyze evidence from sources, and the weighting is 40% and 20 marks. Level 3, you need to interpret, evaluate evidence from sources, engage with sources to determine its usefulness, how reliable it is, bias, and limitations. It also includes compare, contrast, interpretation, and perspectives presented in sources, and draw attention to the conclusions. But what is not on the screen is the paragraph, and that amounts basically to 30%, 16 marks. Now, these are the different levels, level 1, level 2, level 3. Now, we will be going into detail with regard to what is level 1, what is level 2, what is level 3. Let's go to level 1 quickly. Level 1 questions are requiring me and you to extract information from sources and to define historical concepts. These questions carry a maximum mark of 2 marks basically. So 1 times 1, 2 times 1, 1 times 2. Level 1 questions are confronted with question verbs also. Question verbs is basically list, quote, identify, and name. That is what we classify as the question verbs. Now, when we talk about the question verbs, these words are within the questions itself. And once you see list, quote, identify, name, what must you do? You need to indicate or you need to know already that this is a level 1 question. Now, let's look at typical level 1 questions. Typical level 1 questions that you will be confronted with will be as follows. What information in the source tells you about? Quote 2 reasons from the source. What do you understand by the term? So these are the typical level 1 questions that you will be confronted with. Now take a note. We have used quote from the question verbs. So they can also say list, or they can say identify or name certain characters in the source. So we need to understand level 1 questions. It is basically the answers are extracted from the sources. Now we will go into more detail when we answer these questions later, but what I need to inform you, when they say list, you must only list. When they say quote, you only quote what's being asked for. When they say identify, you identify. When they say name, you name. But when it says what information in the source tells you about, so it means now they can also change this question and say according to the source. So when they say according to the source, it means, or what information in the source, it means you must paraphrase. When they say quote, quote informs us basically that we need to write it down as is. Inverted commas in front and at the back, and then we should write it down as is when it is quote. When it says according to the source, we need to paraphrase that given answer. What happens is when they say according to the source, learners are just copy pasting the sources as is when it says according to the source. So learners, we need to refrain from that, because by doing that you will not receive any marks. Then we need to understand what do you understand by the term, or explain the concept. So it means now these questions can change also. So I'm just highlighting to you certain things as we go into the second phase of the of this particular question. There's examples of level 1 questions and level 2 questions. Now let's go to level 2 quickly. Level 2 questions require you to interpret, analyze, and engage with evidence from the sources. So there's three things that needs to take place. You need to interpret the source, you need to analyze the source, and you need to engage with evidence from the sources. So now we can clearly see, but I'll go into more detail with regards to engage with evidence and how to analyze it also. These questions carry a maximum mark of 4 marks. Basically, 2 times 2 equals 4. Yes, some of them is 1 times 2 also. So it means now that it means you must provide one answer, but you will receive 2 marks. Then let's go quickly to the question verbs. The question verbs are as follows: explain, comment, describe, organize. Now, like level 1 questions, there is question verbs also here. So this distinguish now between level 1 and level 2 questions, because level 1 questions, remember, the answers are in the sources. So meaning no learner must get less than 14. So that means now when we come to level 2 questions and we look and we see the question verbs explain, comment, describe, organize, in our minds we should tell ourselves, listen here, these questions I must interpret it, I must be able to analyze, and I must engage the evidence from the sources. And mostly level 2 questions is what we need to paraphrase. It means we need to paraphrase, but there are certain questions. When we go to the typical questions, I'll talk about them. For example, these are the typical questions that you will be confronted with. Comment on the message in the cartoon, for instance. Now on the screen it's written comment. What message does the cartoonist convey? So it could be comment on the message, or explain the message the cartoon conveys unto us. Explain in your own words. This is now basically concepts that we're talking about. So when they say explain in your own words, it's basically concepts that we need to answer. Then why do you think? So why do you think? It's always connected to a particular phrase within the source. For instance, why do you think they said that now that the boundary has been reached already? So why do you now you need to explain, why do you think they indicated the boundary had been reached? So that means, learners, when it comes to level 2 questions, yes, you must interpret, you must analyze, you must engage the sources, but you must be able to understand English as a language, because what do you think? We have reached the boundary. So you need to now analyze that phrase that has been posed unto you. And sometimes learners find it difficult to answer these level 2 questions. Why? Because English is not their mother tongue. It means they need to read more English, and this is why it's so pertinent that we go through old question papers, especially for level 2 questions and level 3 questions. Now let's go to level 3 questions quickly. Level 3 questions require you to explain the different perspectives of sources, draw conclusions about how reliable, how useful, or how biased with regards to the limitations of the source. These questions, they carry a maximum mark of 4 marks, meaning 2 times 4, but they also carry a maximum mark of basically 8 marks, and that's a paragraph question. Now let's go to the question verbs. Question verbs in level 3 questions are compare, contrast, comment, or justify. Now you can clearly see that these level 3 question verbs are different from level 1, level 2, and level 3. When we go back to level 1 talks about list, name, identify, quote. Those are question verbs for level 1. Level 2 questions talks about explain, comment, organize, describe. So now it's imperative that we need to remember these questions, because why? It guides us how we should answer our questions. So when we look at level 3 questions, it talks about compare, contrast, comment, and justify. So when you look at the source must indicate the comparisons. The source must indicate the contrast. Contrast means difference. You must comment basically on a particular reasoning. So when they say comment, it will be comment on how reliable is the source, comment on the usefulness of the source, comment on the limitations of a particular source. Now let's quickly go to to typical questions. It says explain to what extent the evidence in source 1A. Then the second one, compare the evidence in 1A and 1B. Then the next one, comment on the usefulness, how reliable, limitations of the sources. Then we find the paragraph question. Now we will deal into the paragraph question, and when we deal with it, now let's quickly move now into a more deeper instance where we look at the mark allocation of particular questions. Now learners, what do? You first need to read. Take note, you first need to read the question, and after reading the question you will find the mark allocation. The mark allocation will indicate to you how you should respond to a particular question. On the screen it is indicated to you the first two numbers are circled in red, and as they are circled in red we can clearly see 1 times 2 equals 2, 2 times 2 equals 4. Now that informs us learners that basically the first number of the mark allocation indicates the amount of responses that we need to give. So when we look at the amount of responses, we're talking basically about the amount of answers that must be provided. When we go to the next slide, we can clearly see that the first number is circled, meaning number of responses, and each of those responses will receive 1 mark, and that equals to 3. When we look at the bottom one, we can clearly see that the second letter has been circled. So that means the first one is the amount of responses, and the second one is the amount of marks that will be allocated per answer. Take note, there must be 2 answers, and because there must be 2 answers, what does it mean? It means 1 answer will be 2 marks, and it equals to 4 marks basically. Now let's go further into the mark allocation, and what does it mean? If you see a mark allocation of 1 times 1, it will equals 1. If you see a mark allocation of 2 times 1, it will equals 2. If you see a mark allocation of 3 times 1, it will equals 3. This is what we call an extraction question. You go straight to the source and find the answer. Now take note, if it is not quote, if it is not identify, if it is not list, if it is not name, and it says according to the source, take note, you must paraphrase that answer. If you see a mark allocation of 1 times 2, it will equals 2. Now, what does that mean? It means go and look in the sources first. The answer might be there. Or look at the way the question is phrased. It might be telling you to look in the source, according to the source. Now, take note, when it says according to the source, the answer is there, but you must paraphrase it. So what is paraphrase? Paraphrase means you can't write it down as is. If in the source, for example, and I will show you that later, if in the source it is written, Peter was sitting on the fence. Now you cannot write it down as Peter was sitting on the fence. All you need to say is according to the source, Peter was sitting at the fence. So it means now Peter was sitting next to the fence, or he was close to the fence. So we need to paraphrase. It means we need to get similar words that can replace those words that has been put in the source. Now let's quickly go into the mark allocation further. If you see a mark allocation of 2 times 2, it means, take note what we said earlier, the number in front indicates the amount of responses. The second number is the marks that will be allocated for your response that you have provided. This means this is an interpretation, or you must analyze the question. You need to have learned your work. Take note, when it comes to level 2 questions, level 3 questions, you must have studied the work. Because to interpret something or analyze something, you must have background knowledge. And in this case, you must have learned your work in order to look at the source, understand what is being asked of you, and apply your knowledge and understanding in order to answer these particular questions. Remember, look at the mark allocation of the question after you have read the question. And that will guide you as to whether the answer is in the source extraction or whether you have to interpret or provide a analyzation pertaining to a particular question. Now, learners, let's quickly go deeper into level 3 questions. How do sources support each other? That's basically a typical level 3 questions. Compare, contrast questions. How biased is the source? How reliable is the source? Usefulness of the sources, limitations of the sources. Now, these are typical level 3 questions. Take note, when we did the level 3 questions, we could not indicate typical, but these are typical types of level 3 questions that will be posed to you. Now, let's go to support. How do we answer when they say, how does the sources support each other? How does source 1A support 1B with regards to the origins of the Cold War? This question is asking you how the two sources are similar. Take note, when they talk about support, they are talking about similarities. When we talk about similarities, we're talking about how are they the same? What do they have in common? So what do? How do you answer it? You go to source 1A and you find something in that source that is supported, says or shows the same thing in 1B. Now, this is how you should answer it. In your answer, you say, source 1A says, and this is supported by 1B, which says this and this and that. Now, let me just give you an example. Source 1A says there are houses. And this is supported by 1B, which indicates there are big houses. So, what is similar? Houses. So it means now houses are similar. So now we have identified in 1A says there are houses, and this is supported by 1B, which says there are bigger houses. Now you need to go back and you need to find another example of similarities in source 1A and in 1B particular. Now, once we go back, and this is how we answer it, we indicate source 1A says there are cars. And this is supported by 1B, which says there are cars. Now, learners, if the similarities are exactly the same, take note, the first answer that we provided, we said there are houses in 1A, and in 1B, we said there are bigger houses. So it means bigger houses changes the whole similarity. But in the second time, when we went back to 1A and 1B, we said there was cars. So that means now we can say both sources indicate there are cars. Only when the similarities are exactly the same. Now we say both sources indicate there are cars. So learners, this is support. Now let's go to the contrast. Remember what we said. Contrast means clearly we must compare the two sources if there are any differences. Now take note. In the previous years, they have asked, please give the differences from 1A and 1B. And this is how you should actually tackle this. You have to find out how the sources contradict each other. It means, how are the sources opposing each other? How are they different? And this is what you should do basically. You go to the first source and find something that is opposing or opposite or contradicting the second source. Your answer needs to be as follows. In your answer, you should say, source 1A says there are cars, and this is contradicted or in contrast by 1B, which says there are houses. Can you see the contradiction? Houses and cars. Then you must go back and find another example of something that the two sources have that is contradicting or opposing to each other. So learners, now I've explained to you the supporting part, I've explained to you the contradiction part. Now let's go further into level 3 questions, biasness. Now take note, they never ask if the source is biased, but biasness comes in particular when they talk about limitations. What is bias? Bias sources is one view from one individual. It is one person, one country's opinion, thought, feeling on a particular matter. A biased source offers a limited view of something. It means look for the motive of that particular person that's writing there. Now, how can we find the particular motive? By looking at the words. So let's look at reliable. Two questions you ask yourself if you are asking if the source is reliable. First question, is the source accurate? Can the source be trusted? If your answer is yes to both questions, then the source is a reliable one. To find out if it is accurate or if it can be trusted, you need to ask the following questions. Now take note. If you say the source is accurate, if you say the source is trusted, you need to ask yourself further questions when you answer that. And take note, to find out if the source is accurate or trusted, take note, that is always in the caption. Now, what is the caption? The caption is the heading of the source. Now, these are the questions that you should ask yourself. Who wrote it? Who wrote the source? When was the source made? So meaning the date. The date always informs us when was the source made, basically. Then it says, why was it created? So they will indicate when was the source created and the purpose of this particular source. Is the evidence in the source consistent with evidence from other sources? So two questions you ask first: accurate or can it be trusted? Then you ask your source. Then you ask yourself, who wrote it? When was the source made? And who created this source? And can it be corroborated or is it consistent with other sources? Remember now, when we look at evidence in the sources, if it is consistent, we need to look at source 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D, and we need to look at the consistency of that particular source. If there's no consistency, it means the source is not reliable. If there's no date, if it doesn't give us who wrote the source or who made the source, then the source is not reliable. So what am I saying, learners? You need to go to the caption, to the heading first in order to determine this. Then you go to the content and you summarize, and that will give you if it corroborates with other sources as well also. Now let's look at usefulness. Usefulness can be asked in two ways. Comment on the usefulness, explain the usefulness of the source. So the usefulness of the source depends on the purpose of the source. What is the source being used for? Is it relevant to my investigation or to the question being posed? How reliable is the source? Now take note, learners, if you can answer a reliable question, it means usefulness and reliable can be answered in the same fashion. Because when we look at the questions, is it accurate? Is that not the same question that you ask if it's reliable? Yes. Does it mean what it says? Can it be corroborated? It means, is it consistent with other sources? Who produced it? Remember, these are the same questions that we ask when we talk about reliable. So focus on the message of the source, assess whether the information in the source can be used for that particular period or for that event or the topic under the discussion. Now take note, reliable sources can be answered in the same fashion as usefulness, but usefulness is asked in two ways. Comment on the usefulness and explain how reliable, how useful is the source. Now let's quickly go to the limitations. Remember when I was talking about biasness, I said that biasness comes in when they ask you limitation questions. Now, this is what you should look for when you are confronted with a limitation question. These kind of questions point to the quality of the source. So when we talk about the quality of the source, if it does not indicate who wrote the source, if it doesn't indicate a date in the source, if it doesn't give us the purpose why the source was created, it means the source is limited. So what am I doing? I'm telling you how you should answer this. You should write by indicating. It doesn't inform us who wrote the source or who made the source. It doesn't give the date. So that creates what? Limitations. If the source is biased, if it's from one perspective, basically, if it's from one view, now we indicate the source is biased because it only comes from the USA side. The source is biased because it only talks about the National Party's objectives. Then, so you will be looking at things like biasness, first of all, how reliable is the source. So when we talk about biasness, one viewpoint, when we talk about reliable, who wrote the source, the date, and this will then point you in a direction of whether the source will be useful or not. Take note, we're talking about limitations here. So, for example, the source may be limited because it only presents one side or one point of view, and this is what I've mentioned to you. Or it may be limited because the source is not accurate or consistent with other sources. Take note, there's no corroboration with regards to other sources. Now, boys and girls, I have explained to you usefulness, how reliable is the source, biasness of sources, and the limitations. At this point in time, you should be able to answer these questions, but take note, you must have studied your content. Then let's quickly go to the paragraphs. The paragraph question is worth 8 marks. It is assessed using a holistic analytical rubric. The question is phrased so that it remains a level 3 question. For example, explain the role, impact, causes, effects, or significance of particular historical event. The paragraph questions always relates back to the key questions. Now let us just stop there. When you did your first SBA, basically, there was a question in bold on top. And that question on bold is what we call the key question. It was a question in bold, then at the bottom it says question 1. So that informs me now. The key question is your paragraph question. Yes. I'm exactly saying that. So the key question, that's the first question on the question paper, is the paragraph question. Now, because it's a paragraph question, this is how you should answer it. You must, when you deal with source 1A or 3A or 2A, you underline what's answering the key question already. So that is the guide basically pertaining to how you should answer the paragraph question. So when you underline it, you go to 1A, 1B, 1C, 1D. Obviously, when it comes to visual, there's nothing you can underline, but there are certain words that you can use basically. But take note, the visual source always corroborates with another written source. So meaning 3 of the sources will definitely give you answers pertaining to the paragraph question. So as you've underlined it, you paraphrase. Take note, you paraphrase. You don't write it down as is, but you paraphrase it. So when you paraphrase, it means you don't write it as is. And also at the same time, when you paraphrase from 1A, indicate at the end or at first that this information was retrieved from. Now you are going to put it in brackets. Source 1A, brackets, or at the end of the answer you put 1A. Now take note, they say paragraph. If it is not in paragraph form, you will actually be marked down and you will not receive the mark that you're supposed to get. The highest mark that you will be basically getting is what we call level 2. So it means you will not move up to level 3 even if you've got all the answers, because it's in bullet form. Now take note, it must flow as a paragraph is flowing when you're writing your essay basically. Now, we need to understand that the question is basically phrased like this: using information from the relevant sources and your own knowledge. Now, take note, own knowledge learners talks about what you have studied, what you have learned. So you will be indicating when you are dealing with internal resistance what you have learned. And it says, write the paragraph explaining the significance of the internal or the cause of the internal resistance in South Africa. So that means now, yes, most of the bulk of the answers will be from the sources. Like I indicate, 3 sources are speaking to the answer because the visual source relates or speaks to one of the other sources at the same time also. Then take note, no bullet form. It must be in a paragraph form in order for you, and you must indicate where you retrieve the information from. Now, learners, let's quickly go to the question structure. So right now we have dealt with level 1, level 2, level 3 questions. Now let's go to question 1. Now take note, question 1, question 2, question 3 is found in paper 1, and in paper 2 also. Now, what we are going to deal with the structure. When we talk about the structure, we're talking about the setting, how the different levels are set out per question. Now, let's look at question 1. Question 1, it says question number 1.1.1. It says level 1, the mark scheme, meaning mark allocation 1 times 2. Then it says explain the concept. Then the second one, 1.1.2, level 1, Mark scheme, 2 times 1, give 2 reasons. Now we can clearly see in front, the number in front by the mark scheme indicates the amount of questions, the amount of responses we need to provide. The number at the back indicates unto us the amount of marks for your response, for your answer. 1.2.1, level 1, 2 times 1, identify 2. 1.2.2a, level 1, 1 times 2, according to the source. 1 times 2 times 2b, level 1, 1 times 2, according to the source. 1.5.1, level 1, 1 times 2, according to the source. 1.5.3, level 1, 1 times 2, 2 methods. Total marks, 14 marks. Now, learners, you can clearly see that 1.1 means source 1a. 1.2 means 1b. So 1.5 it's basically the last source, 1.1d basically. So now we can clearly see that level 1s are not only asked in one source, but level 1s are asked across the board in that particular question as such. Now let's move to level 2 questions, 1.1.3. Then let's go to the mark scheme. Mark scheme is 2 times 2, using the information in the source and your own knowledge. Now there it comes again, information in the source and your own knowledge. This question, the answer, both answers, take note, both answers could be in the source, or sometimes yes, in the source it's one answer and the other one is own knowledge. So it varies from question to question basically. 1.1.4, it says 2 times 2, comment. 1.2.3, mark scheme, 2 times 2, explain. 1.3.1, 1 times 2, how. 1.3.2, mark scheme, 2 times 2, using the information in the source in your own knowledge. 1.5.2, mark scheme, 1 times 2, comment. 1.4, 2 times 2, comparison. 1.2.4, 2 times 2, usefulness. 1.6, which is the paragraph, take note, which is the paragraph. It's 8 marks. Now take note, learners, you can see clearly by level 3 questions, there are always 3. So question 1, you will notice there's 3. Question 2, you will notice there's 3. Question 3, you will notice there are 3 level 3 questions, but they vary. The only one that remains there is the paragraph question. Now, we will be dealing with the structure of question 2, the structure of question 3, and then you will notice that the paragraph always remain. Question 2 structure, 2.2.1, mark scheme, 2 times 1, quote 2. Next one, 2.1.2, mark scheme, 1 times 2, define concept. 2.1.5, 1 times 2, why according to the information in the source. 2.2.1, 1 times 1, what. 2.2.2, mark scheme, 4 times 1, name any 4. 2.3.1, 1 times 2, why according to the information in the source. 2.1.3, now take note, that is the level 1 questions. So when we look at 2.1, that is source 2a. When we look at 2.2, that is source 2b. When we look at 2.3, source 2c. Let's go to level 2 questions. 2.1.3, can we see that is now found where? In 2a. Then it says mark scheme, 2 times 2, comment. 2.1.4 says 2 times 2, explain. Why do you think? Now, why do you think, learners? The answer is never in the source. It means you must be able to interpret and analyze that particular question. So now you can see, you must know the content of any particular subject and you must practice these questions. If you don't practice these questions, you will be finding yourself in a conundrum. Let's go to the next one. It says 2.5.1, 2 times 2, explain the messages. 2.5.2, comment. Now we go to level 3, 2.3.2, 2 times 2, usefulness. 2.4, comparison. 2.6, paragraph. So now we can see the paragraph always remain. Then let's go to question 3 structure. 3.1.1, the mark scheme 2 times 1, name any two. 3.1.2, mark scheme 2 times 1, what? 3.2.1, 2 times 1, state 2. 3.2.3, what according to flock? Mark scheme 1 times 2. 3.5.1, 1.2, explain the term. 1.5.2, 2 times 1, quote any two. 3.5.3, 2 times 1, select 2. So now we can clearly see, learners, that all the sources have got basically level 1 questions waiting for you to answer. Like I've indicated, it does not mean level 1 questions will only be in source 1A. In this case, it's question 3. It will not be in source 3A, but it will be across the board, as you can see how it's being spread. And when you look at the mark allocation, it means 14 marks. So what does it mean? It means learners are not supposed to get less than 14 marks, because these answers are found where? In the source. So what prevents learners from not getting that 14 marks is if learners didn't study the content, learners are struggling to read, learners cannot command English as a language as such. When I say learners cannot command English, it means learners are struggling to comprehend, to understand English as a language. Now let's go to level 2, 3.1.3. Mark scheme 2 times 2, use the information in the source own knowledge. 3.1.4, 2 times 2, comment. 3.2.2, 2 times 2, using the information in the source and your own knowledge. 3.4.1, 2 times 2, explain why you think. 3.4.2, 2 times 2, comment. Then let's go to level 3, 3.3, comparison. 3.4.4, usefulness. Now take note, usefulness can be asked in two ways. Usefulness can be asked take note, usefulness can be asked, comment on the usefulness, explain the usefulness. Take note, the usefulness can be replaced with limitations. It can be replaced with reliable, because they are almost answered in the same line. Then the paragraph question. Take note, learners, what we did, we explained to you the historical skills, how you should answer the source-based questions, and we went through the structure of question 1, question 2, and question 3. Learners, let's go for a break. On our return, we will be moving into the content of eternal resistance, and then we will be doing a small activity in order for you to have a better understanding, to comprehend how you should answer the source-based questions. Thank you.
Excellence. Excellence is a habit. Excellence is a quality you have, a quality I have. It's a quality we have when we honor what is true to us. Yes, we are gifted differently. uNkulunkulu akasinikanga ngokufana. Excellence is striving for your best. Whenever you have a particular project, test, homework, uzibuze, ask yourself, is this my best? Can I put in more effort? Excellence is striving to be in the top 1% of the area in which you are gifted. And so I challenge you, in every single thing that you do, in every single area that you are gifted in, whether it's sports, it's academic, ukucula, whatever that gift is, strive for excellence.
Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's history lesson. My name is Mr. Dixon. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Saipono Discovery Center. Now, learners, the first session we dealt with how to answer or how to interpret and answer source-based questions. We have dealt with level 1, level 2, level 3 questions. We have also dealt with the structures of question 1, question 2, question 3. Take note, today we are dealing with internal resistance in South Africa, and that is a source-based question for paper 2. Take note, source-based question for paper 2. Now you can clearly see on the screen, we are dealing with the overview, the examination guidelines. It means these are the things that you are supposed to know pertaining to the content of internal resistance in South Africa. Let us go straight into the first bullet. The first bullet talks about, it says, government attempts to reform apartheid, the 1982 Urban Bantu Authorities Act and the Tricameral Parliament in 1983. Take note that the Urban Bantu Authorities Act could be also the Black Authorities Act. Take note, the Black Authorities Act. It was replaced by Urban Bantu, so it could be the Urban Black Authorities Act, which was in 1982, and the tricameral system. Then the second bullet talks about internal resistance to reform. It means the different organizations that stood up against the reforms in South Africa. Bullet number 3, growing power of the trade union movement from 1973, a response to Botha's reforms, new methods of mobilization, labor's rolling mass action, the roles of civics, UDF, mass democratic movement, and end conscription campaign, and black sachet. So this is what we call the examination bullets. Now, all 4 bullets are explained more in detail as we go through this session now. Now take note, these are only the topics, the names of the topics that we are dealing with, but we'll be dealing into detail with it now. Now let's quickly have a background pertaining to South Africa first before we start. Let's quickly have an overview of the internal response to apartheid first, and then we'll go into the content. The 1980s became a turning point in the history of South Africa. Very important that we understand that part. During the 1980s, the apartheid regime came under increasing internal and external pressure. When we talk about internal, we're talking about inside South Africa, there was extreme pressure. When we talk about external, we're talking about our neighboring countries. We talk about countries in Europe, countries in Africa, countries in North, South America, Australasia, and that is what we call external pressure. And the internal and external pressure was to abandon its racist policy called apartheid. Now take note, apartheid is a South African word called segregation internationally. Bullet number 3, P.W. Botha, leader of the National Party, who was take note, he was the Prime Minister at that point in time, of the National Party, attempted a political solution by embarking on a policy of total strategy, which was twofold. Take note, it was twofold. Firstly, to launch a total onslaught against communism, and secondly, to create a superficial tricameral parliamentary system. This attempt by Botha was to tamper with the manner in which the National Party, the NP, governed, but did not necessarily challenge the foundation of the policy of apartheid. Now let's just stop there quickly. P.W. Botha in the late 1970s came up what we call a total onslaught. He came up with the idea there's a total onslaught in the late 1970s against South Africa. So because of the total onslaught, what was that? He indicated that the total onslaught was basically South Africa is under attack by communism. Why? If we look at the map, we find South Africa at the tip of Africa. On our left-hand side, we find a country called Namibia. Now, Namibia before 1989 was classified as Southwest South Africa. It means Namibia was a province of South Africa. So we need to understand that part. On top of Namibia, we find a country called Angola. Now in 1975, Angola became basically a communist country through a political organization. Now, when Angola became a communist country, Botha now indicated that South Africa is under onslaught from who? From communism. Because remember now, if Angola becomes a communist country, Namibia, which was called Southwest Africa, which is a province of South Africa, also becomes a communist country. Automatically South Africa becomes a communist country. And for that reason, he said South Africa has got an onslaught from communism. So he named it a total onslaught. But at the same time, he introduced what we call total strategy for the onslaught. So what did he do first? In 1982, he introduced what we call, take note, in 1982, he introduced what we call the Urban Bantu Authorities Act. Now, the Urban Bantu Authorities Act gave authority unto councillors. So now he created councillors in the townships. Before that, there was no councillors. So he created councillors in the different townships in South Africa. So when we talk about townships, we're talking about Indian areas, we're talking about colored areas, so-called colored areas. We're talking basically about so-called black areas in South Africa. So this total strategy, the first one was the Urban Bantu Authorities Act. So by introducing that, he gave authority to the councillors. At the same time, he released what we call a 99-year lease system. So all the flats that you would see in the townships, people could live there for 99 years. And we know that was impossible for a lot of people to live 99 years. Yes, maybe if there's 100 people, 10 people could maybe live 100 years or over 99. Now, with that introduced, let's move to our next slide. With that introduced, he introduced what you would call a tricameral parliament. Now, take note. On the slide, you can clearly see that the total onslaught, he introduced a total strategy, and it was twofold. It was to reform apartheid and the repression of opposition, basically. Now, the second reform that Botha introduced, it was called the Tricameral Parliament in 1983. 1982, he introduced Urban Bantu Authorities Act, where he gave councillors authority to rule the different townships. But take note, they could only vote in the townships. They could not vote provincially like now or nationally. Then the second one in 1983 was called the Tricameral Parliament. Now, the tricameral parliament was divided into three sections. The first one, House of Delegates, which belonged to the Indians, House of Representatives, which belonged to the so-called coloreds, and the last one was House of Assemblies, which was the whites. Now, blacks were excluded from the tricameral parliament. So what happened is when they went to Cape Town and they met in parliament, all the colored people were grouped together at the back in parliament. All the Indians were grouped together at the back of the parliament. The whites were seated in front of the parliament. The Indians and the coloreds could not be part and parcel with the affairs of the country of South Africa as a whole, meaning Indians and coloreds could not have a say in the law in the country. They were only sitting in the parliament. And this is why the Indians and coloreds that participated in the tricameral parliament were classified as puppets as such. Now take note, because of the formation of the tricameral parliament, the Indians and coloreds were used as puppets, and they were classified also as sellouts that were part and parcel of the tricameral parliament. Now take note, because of the tricameral parliament, there was elections in the different townships, and these elections were not successful at all. Now let's look at our slide quickly. Now, in opposing the tricameral parliament, an organization was formed which was called the United Democratic Front, abbreviated UDF. Who was the leader? The leader of the United Democratic Front was called Dr. Ellen Boesak. Now, Dr. Ellen Boesak was a dominee at the Dutch Reformed Church. So he was now the leader. Now take note, he was the leader, but other leaders were part and parcel of the UDF also. Leaders like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Reverend Frank Chakane. Beyersnoddia was part and parcel of the UDF also. Now take note, learners. These people are from different races. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, classified as a black. Reverend Frank Chakane, classified as a black. Beyersnoddia, classified as a white. And the leader there was uh, Dr. Reverend Ellen Busak. Now, why was the UDF started? First of all, the UDF was affiliated to the ANC. They supported the ideas of the Freedom Charter that was drawn up in the 1950s by the ANC, by the Allied Charter Union, and it embarked on don't vote campaigns. Now, take note, I've mentioned to you that there was elections, and the elections was only in the township. So they went from township to township, and they had a group of people that embark on don't vote. And the success was that 30% of the coloureds went to vote, 20% of the Indians went to vote basically. Then inauguration of the new parliament took place. It means they were introduced. Now, if you became a councillor, it means that whenever parliament met during the year, they would actually, if you live in Johannesburg, they would fly you down to Cape Town. If you were in Cape Town, it was easy access, but you would be part and parcel of that process that took place basically. Now take note, the UDF now opposed the tricameral parliament, and they started to organize strikes at school level. They were boycotting the rent. Take note, the rent was now the 99-year lease. It means that you paid rent every month to the government. So they were striking against the elections. They were striking against the poor school facilities that learners found themselves in the townships, and they were actually striking and boycotting against the rent. And they also introduced what we call consumer boycotts, meaning striking against the goods that left the country as such also. And Botha responded by declaring a state of emergency because of all these strikes in South Africa. Now, what is a state of emergency? State of emergency, it is where the civilians, when we talk about the civilians, the ordinary people in the country, rises up against the authority of the country by demonstrating violently. Meaning now, the ordinary people becomes a threat to the government. And what does the government do? It sends out the army, and the army oppress that resistance that's taking place currently. So in layman's term, state of emergency means the people in the country are rising up against the government. They become a threat to the government sends out the army oppresses that uprising, and that is what we call a state of emergency. So in the 1980s, the army was sent into different townships in order to maintain law and order within the different townships. So black South Africans who participated in the tricameral parliament were normally referred as, like I indicated, sellouts and puppets at the same time. It means that because when an Indian and colored individual went to parliament, they were just sitting, they were not part and parcel of the laws by implementing the laws in the country as such. Then take note, we indicated that the tricameral parliament was it was Indians, House of Delegates, Coloreds, House of Representatives, Whites, House of Assembly. So learners, you need to remember the names of those different groups within the parliament. The Indians stood for what? What was the name of their house? The Coloreds, what was the name of their house? The Whites, what was the name of their house? Then the UDF was opposing it. Then we had another organization which was called the civic organizations. The civics organizations, it was a separate entity, but they work in conjunction with the UDF. Take note, ANC at this point in time was banned. They were not legally they were not legal to operate in South Africa. It means legally the ANC was not supposed to operate. So most of the people that became UDF members, they were in support of the ANC. But the UDF people were people that came basically from what? From the Black Conscious movement introduced by Steve Biko as such. Then the civic organizations, they were the people that tackled bread and butter issues pertaining basically to the rent that had to be paid to the municipality. And they rejected black councillors and black policemen, organized rent and service boycotts, organized kangaroo courts. Basically, what transpired is if they implemented the strike and you decide to go to work on that given day when it's a strike, when you came back, your house was burned down, or they would necklace you. They would put the tire around you, throw petrol around you, and burn you out basically because why? You are not supporting the fight against the system of apartheid, but you are supporting the system of apartheid as such. So, for that reason, you were classified as a traitor and you were not standing with the people at large. Then another organization was called COSAS, Azazu. This organization was basically they formed part of what? UDF. The COSAS also were the students also at school level also being part of the RCL. They basically organized the stayaways of schools, and they were actually the people that were at the forefront when it came to stayaways. When they said there's a stayaway, it means every child knew in the township, no school for you. So basically, the way how you live during COVID, that's how the people used to live in the 1980s. Then we move over. Now, please take note. In 1988, the UDF was banned because of the strikes and the boycotts and people being killed. So in 1988, UDF was banned, and another organization was formed which was called the MDM, Mass Democratic Alignment. So the entire leadership of the UDF, they changed the name only. UDF disappeared because they were banned, but what they do, they renamed it Mass Democratic Movement, MDM. And they continued with the same process that UDF. They had strikes, they had boycotts, consumer boycotts, they have different types of protests against the system of apartheid, especially against the reforms of Botha. Now take note, learners. When Botha came with the reforms, he was the last prime minister in South Africa. But he became the first president in South Africa because he changed the constitution by saying that South Africa does not belong. Take note, whenever there's a prime minister, it means there's a monarchy. So in the early 1960s, South Africa received the independence from Britain. It means South Africa became a republic. And when you are a republic, it means you must have a president. So Botha was the last prime minister and he became the first president in South Africa. Now, when Botha was still president, take note, he was opposing trade unions, but in the late 1970s, they legalized trade unions amongst black people in South Africa. Before that, black people could not belong to a trade union. So what happens is in the late 1970s, trade unions were legalized basically. And what did the trade unions do? They began to organize strikes to destabilize the apartheid regime at that point in time. And at that point in time, the name of the trade union was called FUSATU. And they were aligned to what? Black conscious ideas. At the same time, in 1985, the COSATU was formed. Now, the leader of COSATU at that point in time was our current president, Cyril Ramaphosa. So he was the one he was the leader of COSATU at that point in time. Now, what did COSATU do? They developed close links with the ANC and played a significant role in destabilizing Botha's apartheid system. Take note, the main purpose of the COSATU was basically to destabilize the country so that the National Party must feel forced to change the system of apartheid. So in 1986, there were approximately more than 780 strikes compared to 342 in 1981. So strike action weakened basically the economy of the country. So that means in the 1980s, the economy of the country actually became weak. So we cannot say basically it was the current government that weakened the economy, but it started to grow weak because of the system of apartheid and also of what transpired because of the strikes. Because remember, if there is a strike for one day, the country loses billions as such. So the trade unions also played a significant role. Take note, but it started in the late 1970s where it was legalized, and in 1985 COSATU was established. And when COSATU was established, the trade unions were basically, COSATU became the mother body of all the trade unions in South Africa. When I say mother body, it clearly means that we have a trade union for police, for educators, for prison wardens, for people working in factories. So there are different trade unions, but COSATU is the mother body of the different trade unions. Now let's move over to the next opposition to the system of apartheid. End Conscription Campaign, which is abbreviated ACC. This organization was basically, it was actually white people. Take note, in the late 1970s, if you were in grade 12, they used to come to your school, the government came to your school, the army came to your school, only to white schools. And they would leave a list of names indicating that those learners in grade 12 that will be finishing school the following year, they need to go to a certain army camp in the country. So the End Conscription Campaign, the objective was basically to end the conscription amongst white people. And the end of the conscription was basically that South African Defence Force must be withdrawn from townships. First of all, take note, because of the UDF, they introduced state of emergency. So it means the army was where? It was based in the townships. When I used to be at school, I was taught by army officials basically. So that means the army must be withdrawn from townships first of all. South Africa must end the war in Angola, because that was the reason why. So the war in Angola means to stop communism from infiltrating in South Africa. So in 1985, nearly 8,000 white South African male failed to report for duty. Take note, they were in grade 12 in 1984. 1985, they failed to report. And this is how they were demonstrating that this satisfaction against the system of apartheid. So in 1988, the End Conscription Campaign was banned. So 1988, most of the opposition were banned already in South Africa. Yes, COSATU also was banned in 1988, but they joined hands with the mass democratic movement. Like the End Conscription Campaign, those leadership also joined mass democratic organization. Now, we need to understand, learners, what I've mentioned to you now was basically the content pertaining to the internal resistance. Now, let's go through it again quickly before we move over to the source-based examples. We need to understand that in 1982, Botha introduced his first reform, which was called Urban Bantu Authorities Act, or the Black Authorities Act, which gave rights to councillors to rule or to govern townships. Then he also introduced with the Urban Bantu Authorities Act the 99-year lease system. At the same time, 1983, Botha introduced what we call a tricameral parliament, a parliament for whites, which is House of Assembly, a parliament for Indians, which is House of Delegates, a parliament for so-called Indians, coloureds, which was called House of Representatives. So within the parliament, the whites had the only say. Coloureds, Indians were basically used as puppets in this tricameral parliament. Blacks were excluded. Why were blacks excluded? Because they were scared that if there would be an election, that blacks would outvote them. But at the same time, blacks were also excluded because of the homeland system in South Africa. What were homelands? They were called the reserves. And for this reason, if blacks, the reserves were places like Zululand, Venda, Ciskei, Transkei. So if they left those homelands, they had to come with a passport. And this is where the Dom Pass came in. And this is why it was called Dom Pass. It didn't make sense. They're part of South Africa, but they must walk with the passbook within themselves. But according to the National Party, they believe that, listen here, you are from Zululand, it means you're not part of South Africa. Your country is in Zululand. If you're from Venda, your country is in Venda. Your country is not in South Africa, the mainland. So then what happened is there was opposition to the tricameral system. And that was the first opposition that came to the forefront was the UDF. From the UDF, there were other organizations, the civics and conscription campaign, the Black Sachets, COSAs, basically the trade unions. Now, these organizations oppose the tricameral system at the same time. In 1988, all those organizations were banned, but the names were changed from Mass Democratic Movement. But those organizations went under the banner of Mass Democratic Movement as such. But what we can take note of this, learners, it was not only so-called black people, but it was people from all races that fought against the system of apartheid to come to an end. Now let's quickly go to an activity that I prepared for you quickly. You can clearly see I said source 1A. Now let's read the caption. Take note, when I spoke about reliable usefulness, I spoke about the caption, the heading. This source explains the reasons why P.W. Botha, President of the Republic of South Africa, introduced reforms in 1983. Now let's read through the source. In early 1983, Botha attempted to ease the mounting pressures on the country by introducing some piecemeal reforms to the apartheid policy without relinquishing, giving up white minority rule. He scrapped what he called outdated and unnecessary apartheid status laws, such as the outlawing of mixed marriages and sex across color line, to present a new image of reformist change to the world. It almost succeeded. The Western powers, ever eager to read the South African situation optimistically, positively, were deceived for a time into believing that Botha was really dismantling apartheid. But on a closer examination, when Botha unveiled constitutional changes he intended making, it became clear what he had in mind was not reform, but rather a reformulation, restructuring of apartheid. He set out his plan to establish a tricameral parliament in which the mixed race, colored and Indian minorities would have separate chambers to legislate their own affairs, while the existing much larger whites-only House of Assembly would deal with both whites issues and the nation's general affairs. The huge black majority, meanwhile, would get nothing beyond the right to vote in their remote tribal Bantustans, and the municipal councils would run their separate black townships in so-called white South Africa. But even these urban councils were not autonomous, free. The legislation enabled the white minister to remove members, appoint others, or dismiss the whole council and appoint a new one. It meant that black councils had to implement government policies rather than be responsive to their electorates. Now let's go to the questions that's being posed. So the first question, 1.1, name two apartheid status or laws in the source that P.W. Botha scrapped while introducing reforms to the apartheid policy. Now take note, we said read the question thoroughly, look for the question verbs, and look for typical questions also. So when I look at this question, it says name two apartheid laws. When I look at the word name, it tells me name, it's a question verb for level 1. Look at the mark your location 2 times 1. It means I must provide 2. And when I provide 2, it will give me 2 marks. Let's quickly look at the answers that are being provided. We can see it's a level 1 question. And look, mixed marriages, sex across color line. So I've provided 2 answers. And those 2 answers, one answer will be 1 mark each. And that will give me my 2 marks that I deserve basically. Let's go to the next question, 1.1.2. Explain what is implied by the statement. What he, P.W. Botha, had in mind was not reform, but rather a reformulation of apartheid, or a restructuring of apartheid. So now we can clearly see, explain what is implied by the statement. So when I think back at my question verbs, typical questions, it clearly informs me that this is a level 2 question. Now, let's look at the answers. P.W. Botha's intention was not to dismantle apartheid, but to reinforce, revamp, renew, restructure it in a different way. Now, this is not in the source. It means now I had to create my own knowledge. P.W. Botha's intention was to ensure that the white minority would retain their political power. P.W. Botha wanted to create the impression that the minority groups were included in the power-sharing government. P.W. Botha's intended changes were cosmetic, as whites would still deal with white issues and also have a say over the majority issues. P.W. Botha wanted apartheid to look less discriminatory to the outside world. Any other relevant responses to the question being posed? Now, when I look at my second last question, P.W. Botha's intended changes were cosmetic, as whites could still deal with white issues and also have a say over the majority issues. Now, this is being mentioned, the idea is being mentioned in the source, but it is not phrased the way it's being phrased here. So this comes in when we talk about paraphrasing. The idea is there, it's in the source, but it's not phrased exactly the way this answer is phrased to us. Now let's go to more questions. 1.1.3, define the term tricameral parliament in your own words. So this is a definition. Now take note, learners, definitions are never in the sources. Let's look at the answer. The tricameral parliament was a three-chamber parliament for whites, coloreds, and Indians representatives, while Africans were excluded. The tricameral parliament had three separate chambers where coloreds and Indian representatives were made to believe they could oversee their own affairs, while whites dealt with the affairs of all. So now we can clearly see definitions are not in the sources. We need to study our definitions. Let's go to the next question, 1.1.4. Using the information in the source and your own knowledge, explain why you think the black majority was excluded from the new legislation. Now take note, I gave you two answers already. Let's see if we can get this right. And look, it says 2 times 2. First answer, provision was made for them to vote in the Bantustans. Didn't I say to you that the blacks were excluded because why? They believe that black people must vote in the Bantustans. Like I've mentioned few. I've mentioned Zululand, I've mentioned Ciskei, I've mentioned Transkei, I've mentioned Venda. So they had to vote it. That was the first reason basically. Or the ones that were staying in the white South Africa can only vote in the municipals or local councils. The National Party granted them political rights in the Bantustans. If included, they would outvote the white voters who were in the minority. If included, they would change the apartheid laws and address the inequalities. Africans would not be able to fight for their rights, to protect white privileges, to weaken resistance against apartheid. Any other relevant responses? 1.1.5, identify 4. So when we look at identify, typical questions must come to mind. Okay, this is level 1 question. It means where's the answer? In the source. In the source that the white minister had over black people. Now let's look at the answers quickly here. So we must provide 4 answers. Remove members, appoint others, dismiss the whole council, appoint a new one. Now learners, this was just an activity of one source base. Because of time, we can't do more questions because of time basically. So these are just an activity and you should go through this activity and then you will notice basically it's an old question, it's an old source from an old question paper that I use and I present it to you so that you can have an understanding how you should answer your questions basically. Now, learners, it is imperative that we understand that we spoke about a tricameral parliament, we spoke about the UDF, we spoke about the civics, we spoke about COSAS, we spoke about the end conscription campaigns, we also spoke about the trade unions. Now, take note, what the examiners do is they would actually ask questions only on how the UDF responded to the tricameral system, or they will only ask about the implementation of the UDF and the opposition, basically, or they can only ask questions on the trade unions. So it means now the content that I presented to you is what you need to study. You need to study the content, because if you study the content, you will be able to answer any question pertaining to the source-based questions that's being posed to you, basically. Now take note, the source-based now the sources changes from exam to exam. If it's a test, if it's a SBA, we need to understand it will change. So learners, what am I saying? You need to know the content pertaining to the different topics that you are dealing with per question. Now learners, thank you for watching this lesson, and hope to see you again, to tune in again next week, same time. Bye.